Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening to my brothers and sisters who have been patient enough to follow me for the third lecture. I thought I have bored some of you into not listening to me anymore, but Alhamdulillah, you persevered, and hopefully we learn from each other tonight.
Inshallah.
And I hope to make the best use of the time, of the 1 hour, which is given to me to convey my thoughts on tonight's topic, which is the decline of Islamic science and the rise of science in Europe. Before that, I refer you to the slides. Can we start with the first one? This is the last, I think.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay. So before that, I just want to say a few words. Yeah, maybe to clear the air a bit. Yeah? Well, I have written a couple of articles actually on this subject, and one of it was published in a book edited by Arun Bala and Prasenjit Dwara. I'm not sure whether the camera is able to see the book here. I'm trying to show it in front, but since it's screen sharing, so maybe it's not possible.
Yeah,
anyway, yeah, the book is called The Bright Dark Ages, where the idea of the Dark Ages is contested, especially since it only applies to Europe during that period, but not in the Islamic world. And it's edited by Arun Bala and Prasenjit Dwara. It's published by Bridle, the famous publisher for Oriental Studies. And my contribution in that book is a chapter which is entitled Rethinking the Needham Question, Why Should Islamic Civilization Give Rise to the Scientific Revolution? Because there's been a debate between scholars on the subject of history of science and scientific revolution. And one of the questions which was posed was, despite the advances made by the Muslims during the Middle Ages, the scientific revolution did not arise or emerge from Islamic civilization, but instead it came out of Europe, out of Western civilization. So why was this the case? And obviously, one of the reasons why the scientific revolution did not occur in Islam was because of the decline of science in Islamic civilization beginning around the 14th century. Well, again, this period of decline is contested amongst scholars. Some claim that it, for example, Toby Huff mentioned that it occurred somewhere around the 13th century. Some of the scholars dispute that, and for example, Ahmad Y. Hassan, in one of his articles, claimed that the decline only started around the 16th century. So there's a variation of opinion on this matter from 13th to 16th century. I believe that it occurred somewhere around the 14th century. And the reasons that are involved are complex, and I must confess right from the outset that unlike the earlier lectures, or unlike some of the lectures which I normally give, where I normally feel confident about giving the lecture, for tonight's lecture, I have to give a sort of a pessimistic disclaimer in saying that my thoughts on this matter are still not finalized yet. Yeah? I'm still in search of the answers because of the difficulty of the subject matter, and because the amount of research that is needed in order to give a fairly conclusive answer to some of the questions which has been raised and which I have raised in my own mind. And questions like, for example, what were the real causes of the decline of Islamic science? And was the scientific revolution really an unmixed blessing, um, something which inaugurates the coming of modernity, or is conducive towards the rise of modernity, and whether that is simply a good thing or whether there are problems with that. Yeah. And this whole issue of the significance of science in culture, in contemporary culture, and also in Islamic civilization. So I use terms like, for example, the Muslim dilemma and so on, because I think the question is not, and the answers perhaps are not straightforward too. Yeah? But I will try to at least present the problems as I see it, yeah? And share my views with you all, yeah? And perhaps get your response on this. Yeah? Because as I've said, it's, to me, it's still open-ended, and I don't really have the answers to some of these questions, which I have been working on for quite some time. Yeah? Okay, so just to give a brief outline and overview of some of the things that I will be touching on tonight. Yeah? Number one, I will say something about the theories of the decline of Islamic science as has been presented by various scholars on the history of Islamic science. Some of the perceived factors, or some of the factors which were thought to be responsible for the decline of Islamic science, beginning around the 14th century, as I've said, and discussion on the so-called Al-Ghazali factor in the decline of Islamic science. Some have mentioned, some scholars have mentioned that Al-Ghazali's critique of Greek philosophy and Muslim philosophers who espouse Greek philosophy, philosophers such as Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, was an important factor that contributed towards the decline of Islamic science by way of its critique of Greek philosophy, thereby discouraging the study of Greek philosophy, including natural philosophy, in the Islamic world, and that Greek philosophy, natural philosophy, was thought to be important for the development of science. So this issue I will take up, and I will try to give a more detailed discussion of it. Yeah. I think that there is it's not a simplistic matter whether Al-Ghazali did or did not contribute to the decline of Islamic science through his critique of Greek philosophy. I think the issue is more complex and complicated than that, and I will try to clarify it as best as I can, yeah, because it requires some background knowledge and so on, and I have to perhaps go step by step. Okay, another point is I will be making a comparison with the European experience in the rise of science in the West. Why was it that when Islam or Islamic civilization went through a period of decline with respect to the development of science, somewhere around the 14th century, Europe, on the other hand, developed and advanced the sciences, including the natural sciences. So again, there is a sort of a reversal of fortune. This thing about the rise and fall of civilizations, the rise and fall of science and so on. It has been discussed by Muslim scholars like Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun's great work, the Muqaddimah, mentioned about and analyze and discuss the question of the rise and fall of dynasties. And he also touched on the subject of the rise and fall of science. His theory was that science advance and progress and flourish if there is a demand for it. Yeah, demand by society for scientific knowledge. When there is no demand, or when there is little demand for it, then science goes through a period of decline. So interesting theory by Ibn Khaldun. So this reversal of fortune, as we have mentioned before, when Europe went into the Dark Ages, it was Islamic civilization that saved Greek knowledge by translating Greek science and philosophy into Arabic, and thereby making it available to Muslim scholars to study and develop the Greek sciences and philosophy. And Islamic civilization thereby became the torchbearer of scientific development in the Middle Ages, until about the 12th century, when that knowledge was retransmitted back to Europe via Spain by the translation movement of the 12th century, which saw Arabic works in science and philosophy by Muslim scholars being translated into Latin by European scholars, which made the knowledge of Greek science and philosophy, and also the additions to it by the Muslim scholars, available to the West, beginning in the 12th century. And thereby we see a continuous progression of science in the West through the institutionalization of science in the medieval universities. Yeah? But especially after the fall of Baghdad in 1258, science went through a period of decline in Islamic civilization. So again, as I said, there was a reversal of fortune in which when Islamic science was going through a period of decline, especially since the 14th century, Europe developed the natural sciences and philosophy through its institutionalization in the universities, especially, which finally led to the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Yeah. So I will, in discussing the development of Islamic science, I will also be making comparison with the development of science in Europe, because as I've said, the two are connected, they are intertwined. Yeah. So one cannot really discuss one without mentioning the other because of its connectedness. Yeah. And only by making that connection will things get clearer, I believe. Yeah? And also by comparing it with the European experience, we can perhaps have some understanding of why science did not continue to flourish in Islamic civilization, and instead, instead science, in the form of modern science, emerged in the West, emerged in Western civilization, and saw its continuous progress and development, which finally led to the West becoming great powers, yeah? In science, technology, economy, and military power also, that I believe was partly responsible for the age of imperialism and colonialism, yeah? Which saw the West conquering lands which are inhabited by Muslim societies, yeah? Muslim communities. Yeah? So this seesaw, as I say, this changes in power and knowledge, yeah? And relationship between power and knowledge between Islam and the West. I think it's an interesting subject for studying. Okay, and then I will also, as I've said, we cannot make sense of science in Islam unless we make comparisons with what happened in Europe. So I will also mention about the development of science in Europe, especially focusing on the subject of science and religion, relationship between science and religion in Europe in the 17th century and after the 17th century. And in this regard, I will be mentioning the significance of the Catholic-Protestant divide in the Western world and its significance for the rise of science in the West. And then I will say something about a similar kind of divide, as I see it, between the Sunnis and the Shia in the Muslim world. And as I've said here, this is considered as a counterpart to the Catholic Protestant divide in Christian Europe. But unlike in the West, where the rise of Protestantism was somehow responsible or did contribute towards the rise of science in the West, the Sunni-Shia divide did not have a similar effect. Yeah, one would have thought that, well, perhaps Al-Ghazali's critique of philosophy in the Sunni world did not have any effect on the development of philosophy in the Shia Islam, yeah? and thereby suggesting that science could have developed in Muslim countries or communities where Shiism is dominant, yeah? But that did not happen. Yeah? So this brings to my mind the nature of the explanation of the phenomena of the rise of science, that it is not a monocausal explanation, that you cannot understand the phenomena of the rise of science in a particular civilization in terms of any one cause or factor. It has you have to look at it in a multi-causal form, that there are a number of causes that contribute towards it, and that they interact in a certain way. Yeah? So there are two things there, that it's not only one factor or one cause that contributes towards the rise of science. It's multi-causal, meaning to say that there are more than one cause. There are several causes, and that these causes have to be combined in a certain way. They have to interact in a certain way in order to produce that effect. So that's basically my explanatory model of the phenomena. Yeah? And so to me, it's quite pointless to make statements like, for example, why is it that there's a similar Shia Sunni divide in the Muslim world like the Protestant Catholic divide, and yet science did not emerge in, or rather the scientific revolution did not emerge in the Muslim world. So I think that kind of comparison is quite simplistic. Yeah? But I mentioned it nevertheless because it might be considered as a plausible explanation by some. So, but I, after having said that, I then immediately qualify myself by saying that, well, you shouldn't simply look in terms of any single factor, but should look at it as a whole, as a combination of several factors. And then I will look especially at the role of natural philosophy in the development of science, especially after the 17th century, because this has become a controversial issue. What is the role of philosophy, especially in philosophy of nature, in the rise of modern science? Yeah? Because as I've said earlier, one of the criticisms that have been made is the criticism, the famous criticism against Al-Ghazali. Yeah, that his critique of natural philosophy or Greek philosophy in the Islamic world was responsible for the stagnation and decline of science in the Muslim world. Yeah? So this issue of whether natural philosophy is really important for the further rise and development of science is therefore an important question. Yeah? And it's also related to the judgment of whether Al-Ghazali was really a factor or an important factor in the decline of science in Islamic civilization. And as I've said earlier, it's not an easy matter to decide. I mean, and also you cannot give a sort of a simplistic answer in terms of yes and no. That's why I have to look at the role of natural philosophy in order to be fair to Al-Ghazali in making a judgment or evaluation of his role in the development of science in Islam. And then I will mention also about the role of the experimental method in the development of science and how that was done in a systematic and organized and institutional way in the West as compared to Islam. Because in Islamic civilization, although there were individual scientists like Ibn al-Haytham who carried out experiments, but it was more of an individual affair rather than rather than making it part of scientific methodology as a whole in Islamic science. Okay, and then I will say something about natural philosophy, but this time in relation with experimentation, because the rise of modern science, as I will mention later, is a result of the combination of three important components or elements, which is number one, natural philosophy, number two, mathematics, and number three, the experimental method. And I will explain that. And lastly, I will talk about the fusion of theory and practice in science after the scientific revolution. Basically, saying that theory and practice is combined in modern science, where you not only have scientific theories, but you also have the confirmation of those theories through experimental proof, through experimentation. And that's how science became practical or became applied. In up until the 16th century, science was still theoretical largely. It was not applied. And the so-called practical sciences, they were mainly devoid of theory. The kind of science that we have today, where we have combination of theory and experiment and practice, is a fairly new development. And the combination of theory and practice in science has important cultural implications, which I will discuss later on. Okay, can you move on to the next slide? Okay, yes, next slide. Theories of the decline of Islamic science. Some of the theories that have been presented are by scholars such as Toby Huff, an American historian and sociologist of science, who has written the book "The Rise of Early Modern Science: Islam, China, and the West," where he discussed the development of science in Islamic civilization, Chinese civilization, and Western civilization. And his theory basically was that it's more of an institutional and normative reason as to why science did not continue to develop in Islam. He was appreciative of the fact that Islamic science did flourish during the Middle Ages, especially between the 9th to the 12th centuries. And there were important contributions to the world of science made by Muslim scientists in various fields such as astronomy, medicine, mathematics, physics, especially optics, and the early part of chemistry, alchemy, and so on. He did acknowledge contributions made by the Muslims, but he felt that Islamic culture as a whole, is in general, was not truly accommodative of science because of the differences in the value system, the value system of science and the value system of religion. And in Islamic society, religion plays a very important role in determining social practice and the kind of education which is to be encouraged in the mainstream of Islamic culture. Yeah? And here it is the religious sciences that predominate. And the so-called ilm awail, or the foreign sciences or the ancient sciences, which refers to what we understand as the natural sciences. Subjects such as astronomy, physics, mathematics, including natural philosophy to some extent, and so on. These were considered as secondary or ancillary subjects, and they were only entertained in the madrasas insofar as they serve religious purposes. Yeah. So there is that element of marginality. So in a sense, I think half opts for the marginality thesis in explaining the presence of science in Islamic civilization. So in a sense, science is not sustainable given that kind of value structure, value system, and also the presence of other external factors such as the political conditions, that prevail later on. So all these things help to explain why science did not emerge in the West. In Islam, or did not emerge in a more advanced form as seen in the scientific revolution. Okay, and then we move on to Prof. Hudboy, who wrote the book Islam and Science. Again, Hudboy, like Taff and other scholars, were critical of the orthodoxy. Yeah? The orthodoxy, the conservative ulamas, who were critical and suspicious of the foreign sciences. Yeah? And Prof. Hudboy pointed out that the presence of caliphs such as Al-Ma'mun, who adopted the Mu'tazilah ideology, Mu'tazilah Kalam, or school of thought in philosophy, they are the ones who were responsible for the rise of science in Islamic civilization through the creation of institutes such as the Baitul Hikmah and so on, which saw the translation of Greek works into Arabic language. Yeah? So for Hudboy, it is orthodoxy that prevented the further continuation of science in Islamic civilization. Yeah? Although, of course, this view also has to be taken with a pinch of salt, yeah? Because as has been pointed out by some scholars, including George Saliba, I think, the progress of science continued in Islamic civilization even during the period of the Caliph Al-Mutawakkil, who was known for his conservatism and orthodoxy. Yeah. So Al-Mutawakkil was almost the opposite of Al-Ma'mun in terms of ideology, views on religion and so on. He obviously was not a Mu'tazilite, Al-Mutawakkil. He favored revelation as opposed to reason. And yet, we saw the translation works continuing during the time of Al-Mutawakkil. And I think that was somewhere around the 9th and 10th centuries. And during those centuries, 9th to 10th century, we still see important contributions made by Muslim scientists. So to me, it's not completely true that the presence of Orthodox caliphs such as Al-Mutawakkil necessarily dampened the development of science. And I think a more important factor is the political factor due to the invasion of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258, which saw the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Abbasid Empire, and which saw the disintegration of central political authority in Islam, and thereby depriving Muslim scientists of patronage, because since there was no specialized institution of science. Scientists who work individually on an individual basis and depended on patronage by caliphs and by important people in society. So if they are deprived of patronage by the caliphs, then it's not likely that they're able to continue with their scientific work. Okay, and then look at the theory proposed by Abdul Hamid Sabra on the decline of Islamic science. And here I refer to his important article published in 1987 and published in the Journal History of Science, where he talks about the appropriation of science, yeah, from Greek civilization into Islamic civilization. And here he argued against the marginality thesis. He presented that marginality thesis in his article, but then rejected it and replaced it with what is later known as the appropriation thesis, where science, or rather the foreign sciences, the science, acquired from Greek manuscripts and so on, this knowledge was assimilated by the Muslims and made part of Muslim culture and knowledge system. But even Sabra did not reject the marginality thesis completely, at least as I see it. So to my mind, although Sabra was critical of the marginality thesis, he did not totally oppose or reject it. He accepted parts of it. Yeah? And I think this is especially true when he mentioned that the Muslims appropriated Greek knowledge in the form of astronomy, mathematics, and so on, insofar as it served religious functions and religious purposes. Yeah. So it was more of an instrumentalist approach towards Greek knowledge. Yeah. And in other words, the foreign sciences were not pursued for its own sake. Yeah. It's not a case of Muslim society or the Muslim elites giving free rein to Muslim scholars to develop Greek science on their own and develop their own theories independently of religious control. And here Sabra brings in Al-Ghazali. Ghazali's critique of philosophy to substantiate his point. Yeah? And he mentioned how free thinking or philosophical thinking, which is based on reason and the search for truth according to Greek ideals, perhaps was not seriously entertained in Islamic world, and in fact was even discouraged or disallowed. So Sabra did have some grave reservations about the autonomy of science in medieval Islamic civilization. And then briefly, I will mention something about the views of Edward Grant, the famous American historian of science. And one of the things that Grant mentioned was the absence of the class of people which he termed as the natural philosophers come theologians. Theologians who are also natural philosophers, yeah, and able to accommodate Greek natural philosophy within the religious framework. So this class of people, according to Grant, did exist in the West. And he mentioned names like, for example, Jean Buridan, who was a famous philosopher and scholar in France. If I'm not mistaken, he was based at the University of Paris, Jean Buridan, and he had his own theories of motion and so on. And John Buridan is an important example of this class of theologian natural philosophers. Another name is Nicole Orame, also another famous scholar who came up with certain ideas about motion, mechanics, medieval theories of mechanics, mentioned these two names, John Buridan and Nicole Orim, both French, I believe. And also the Merton School, Merton College in Oxford. They also have people like Thomas Bradwardine and so on. So they were both theologians as well as philosophers, natural philosophers. Whereas that class of people was quite absent in the Islamic world. For example, Al-Ghazali, he was considered as a theologian, but obviously he did not entertain Greek natural philosophy in his theology. And you can hardly find this group of people which Grant refers to as the theologian natural philosopher in Islamic culture. For example, if you look at Ibn Rushd, he would be one possible candidate for this class of theologian natural philosophers, because he was both into Aristotelian philosophy, natural philosophy, as well as being grounded in Islamic thought. But because of his leanings towards Aristotelian philosophy, and I believe that Ibn Rushd was referred to as the second Aristotle or something, or the second master, his deep, his entrenched Aristotelian views about the world and so on, this made him suspect amongst the conservative ulama. And so figures like Ibn Rushd, for example, was more welcome in the West rather than Islam. So in the controversy between Al-Ghazali, or followers of Al-Ghazali, and Ibn Rushd, in the Islamic world, it was Al-Ghazali who predominated, or followers of Al-Ghazali who prevailed over Rushd. Although, mind you, they were not contemporaries. Some people thought that the debate between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd was contemporaneous, meaning to say that they lived during the same period. No. Ibn Rushd came later, but he did come up with a work called Tahafut al-Tahafut, which was a direct critique of Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? Okay, factors for the decline of Islamic science. What are some of the factors for the decline of Islamic science? Okay, I will mention the second point first briefly because I've mentioned it earlier. The Mongol invasion of Baghdad in 1258 and the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate. One must remember that the Baitul Hikmah, for example, was centered in Baghdad, and the Abbasid Caliphate or the dynasty was the one that provided patronage for development of science and for the livelihood of scientists in the Muslim world. So it is very important that this support and patronage by the Abbasid caliphs continue if science were to be sustainable in the Islamic world. But after the Mongol invasion of Baghdad in 1258, things came apart. And as we know, the Mongols have no appreciation of knowledge, just like how the Barbarians were when they attacked Rome. They have no appreciation of knowledge. So a similar fate befell the Islamic world. And as you know, the Mongols massacred hundreds of thousands of Muslims and also destroyed some of the books. They were thrown into the river Tigris or Euphrates, and it was said that the river became black from the books. So all this pursuit of knowledge was reversed because of the Mongol invasion. And later developments in science only continued in the field of astronomy because of the Mongol patronage of the observatories. Because the Mongols, they were not that they were interested in astronomy as such, but because of their interest in astrology, yeah, astrology and fortune telling, and a sort of consultation on what's good and what's not good to be done, yeah, by reading the stars, as it were. So there was some progress being continued under the Mongols, but for non-scientific reasons, like the Mongol interest in astrology, which led them to patronize the development of the observatories and gave support to the astronomers and so on. So people like Nasruddin al-Tusi, yeah, were supported by the Mongol rulers. But other than that, the Mongol invasion had a terribly negative effect on the development of science in Islam. And then the third factor is what is referred to by Sabra and other scholars as the instrument, or Forrest Cohen called it the Alexandrian character of Islamic science and the limitations inherent in such an approach. Yeah? Alexandrian character is a phrase, is a word coined by the historian of science Forrest Cohen. Yeah? And this refers to the fact that Alexandria was an important center of science in the Hellenistic period and after, in the early Middle Ages. But the Alexandrian approach was more of a practical and engineering approach, an instrumentalist approach. It was not a theoretical approach, unlike what Forrest Cohen calls the Athenian character of science, based on the word Athens, because in Athens you have all the Greek natural philosophy, the philosophies of Aristotle and Plato and so on, which was more theoretical. Yeah, so Islamic science basically was more practical rather than theoretical. Yeah? Whereas the further development of science needed the theoretical base. Yeah, you reach a sort of a saturation point in the development of an instrumentalist Islamic science. So that's why Islamic science did flourish, because of this instrumental and practical character. But that kind of approach has its limitations, has its own saturation point, which is why beyond that it cannot progress further. So to me, it's not surprising that although Islamic science did flourish at one point in history, it could not go further. Yeah, and why could it not go further? Because of the lack of a theoretical base. And we will see this in Europe, how the development of science took place in Europe. And it has something to do with the theoretical development of science in Europe. Okay, I will mention more about that later. Okay, the fourth point is the absence of a class of theologian natural philosophers who are able to reconcile natural philosophy and Islamic methods, absent in Islamic world. Okay, I think I've mentioned about that earlier, so I don't need to dwell on that further. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? Now, I'll make some comparisons with Europe. Now, as I've said, the translation movement of the 12th century saw the dissemination of knowledge back and the retransmission of knowledge back into Europe via Spain. Yeah. And this knowledge was preserved and also taught. That means there was a circulation of knowledge, distribution of knowledge, circulation of knowledge, engagement of with the knowledge that they have through the knowledge being taught in medieval universities as part of the arts curriculum. Yeah? So the medieval universities, they basically have 4 different faculties. Yeah, that's a normal university structure in the medieval universities. They have the faculty of medicine, produce medical doctors. They have the faculty of law, which is relevant for administration and government. And then they have a faculty of theology, which is to do with the clergy and the Catholic religious institution, the priests to provide, graduates who will serve in the clergy and so on, like part of the Roman Catholic Church. And then you have the fourth faculty, which is the faculty of arts. Yeah. And it is in the faculty of arts that natural philosophy and the Greek sciences and philosophy were taught as subjects, you see. So you have theories of, nature, Greek theories of nature, Greek philosophies of nature by Aristotle, Plato, the pre-Socratics and the Stoics and so on being taught as part of natural philosophy. And then you have astronomy, mathematics, and so on, also, and logic being taught under faculty of arts. Yeah? So that knowledge was institutionalized through being taught and being made part of the educational curriculum in the medieval universities. Yeah, and the teaching of those subjects are protected. Yeah, because universities have their own statutes later on, and they're quite an autonomous body. Yeah, it's a community in itself and quite protected from intervention from outside, from the rulers and from the state. So there was that autonomy in the teaching of science and its institutionalization in Europe. Although, of course, they have a way of protecting religious belief by making the philosophy, the faculty of theology to be and have a more prestigious status, and not only prestigious status, but the professors from the faculty of arts are not allowed to teach in the faculty of theology. So they have this institutional arrangement to protect religious belief, yeah, by virtue of not allowing the philosophy professors to teach at the theology faculty, but allowing the theology professors to teach at the faculty of arts and the philosophy faculty. Yeah. So the influence is one way. Theology can influence the arts and natural philosophy, but natural philosophy is not allowed to exert its influence over theology. So there is that safety mechanism which makes the ruling class, I suppose, the religious elites also comfortable about having Greek philosophy being taught at the universities. Yeah. But in the Islamic world, there wasn't this institutional accommodation of science within the education system. So science was not institutionalized and not part of the state education system. Yeah. It was more due to the efforts of individual scientists, like, as I mentioned, the great names like Hazim, Al-Khwarizmi, and so on. But once the structure, the state structure, does not allow for individual scientists to operate, then science becomes unsustainable in Muslim culture, I say, because it was not institutionalized. It was more of individuals being allowed to practice science under state patronage. But as I've said, with the dissolution of the Abbasid Caliphate, the whole thing broke up, it fell apart. But in Europe, it was quite stable. The medieval universities continued, yeah, until now. Those universities like University of Paris, University of Oxford, they're still here today, yeah, despite their medieval origins and roots. Yeah? So there is a continuity of learning in the West, which allowed for the science to continue to progress. Yeah. Although, of course, there have been revolutions in scientific theories, which led to the rejection of even medieval science, apart from rejection of ancient sciences. But that institutional structure allowed for those changes to occur in a fairly stable context, so that it was not disruptive, but led to continuous growth. Okay, and then other factors like, for example, the adoption of the experimental method in 17th century. And this is also significant in the development of science, because then science has an experimental base and theory can be combined with practice. Yeah, the theories can actually be tested and see whether it works in practice. And that is due to the adoption of the experimental method. And that the experimental method became part of scientific methodology. It was not a one-off thing, or it was not something which is done in an ad hoc manner by individuals, but became part of the system, of the scientific system. And this has to do with the work of the Royal Society, which was an important scientific society in the 17th century. So another factor in the rise of science in the West is the establishment of scientific societies, which are recognized by the state. For example, the Royal Society is given a royal charter, which means to say that the state confers a certain status to it and recognizes it as an autonomous body to operate. Yeah. Okay. And the same thing happened in France, the Académie des Sciences, Academy of Sciences, based in Paris in 1666, again allows for the association of scientists to function within French society as an institution in itself. Again, after the Baitul Hikmah, there were no similar institutionalization of knowledge in the Islamic world. And relationship between science and religion, even in the West, was not smooth. Yeah. So, to those who said that, well, maybe science did not continue to develop in Islam because of the religious factor, that the orthodoxy was not receptive of the further development of science. They were not encouraging of the development of science, and in fact prohibited perhaps the further development of science. Well, if you say that, then you can also say that the same thing occurred in the West. Yeah, but why is it that science continued to develop in the West? A striking example to me is the confrontation, I would use a strong word, confrontation, between Galileo and the Roman Catholic Church in the 17th century. Yeah. And what was the issue about? The issue was about the heliocentric theory in astronomy. Yeah. Now, the earlier theory in astronomy was the geocentric astronomy, which says that the Earth is at the center of the world, center of the universe, and that the sun and the moon and the planets revolve around the Earth. You see, and that was the position which was adopted by the Roman Catholic Church as its official view or doctrine on the matter. Yeah, and the church fathers, the figures say that, well, this was also the position adopted by the early church fathers. Yeah, they interpreted biblical passages to mean that the biblical belief, or the Christian belief, is that the Earth is at the center of the universe, of the world. Yeah? And for someone like Copernicus or Galileo to say that the center of the world is not the Earth but the sun, and that the Earth moves around the sun, is considered as heresy, is heretical. Yeah. So when Galileo supported the theory and published a book called Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems in 1632, he was put on trial in 1633 and he was found guilty. And therefore, there was this religious censorship of science. through this strong action taken by the Roman Catholic Church, through the Roman Inquisition. In fact, he was subjected to the Roman Inquisition. Yeah? But Galileo was only put under house arrest, contrary to what some people thought. He was not really harshly punished, he was put under house arrest. But nevertheless, the effect on development of science in the Catholic world was negative. It retarded the development of science in Catholic Europe, Catholic countries such as Italy. But because Europe was divided into Protestant and Catholic in terms of religious orientations, scientists were still able to flourish in Protestant societies and Protestant countries, yeah, like England or Britain, like Holland or Netherlands, and the Scandinavian world. Yeah? So that was an important factor. Protestantism was an important factor in allowing for science to continue to flourish in Europe. So there was a sort of religious accommodation of science within Protestant culture in Europe, whereas in Islam, Shiism was not strong enough to provide that sort of role. Okay, can we continue with the next slide, please? Okay, now here, I again refer to the views of Abdulhamid Sabra concerning the role and the place of philosophy and science in the Islamic world. Yeah. So here, I just read from Sabra. He said, the philosophical sciences, al-ulum al-hikmiyah, had entered Islamic intellectual life under the banner of an articulated concept of hikmah, or philosophical wisdom, which involved a doctrine of knowledge quite distinct from the view just outlined, with a more pragmatic or utilitarian view of knowledge. According to this doctrine, the aim of theoretical investigation, whether mathematical, physical, metaphysical, was to ascertain the nature of all things as they are in themselves, to the furthest extent possible. And the aim of the investigator was to gain knowledge of the truth for the sake of knowing the truth. In other words, knowledge for its own sake, yeah? Not for the sake of serving some other purpose, like, for example, even religious purpose like astronomy being used to calculate distances or direction of the Qibla or prayer times and so on. But astronomy for the sake of knowing what the real constitution of the universe is, and the arrangement of planets, the stars and suns and so on. So knowledge for the sake of knowledge, for knowing the truth itself. The metaphysically inclined seeker after the truth, namely all the great philosophers of Islam and the majority of mathematicians in the earlier period, also believed the value of all science was to perfect the human soul and prepare it for a state of eternal happiness, which was the same vision and aim which Al-Ghazali had. Yeah? But for Al-Ghazali, this was to be acquired through religious knowledge, not through independent philosophical thought. Yeah? But for the philosopher and philosophically committed scientists, this was not a state that transcended philosophical activity. That means this hope of securing eternal salvation, happiness, and so on, is to be done through philosophy itself. So it's not something which is outside the philosophical inquiry. So, for example, for Ibn Rushd, yeah, his philosophical quest should, in a sense, provide for his own salvation. Yeah, but this was not something which was seriously entertained in the Islamic world, which is why Ibn Rushd was quite marginal to mainstream Islamic culture and belief system. It was for the philosophers, Muslim philosophers, it was to be achieved, in fact, only through philosophical activity. And one was closer to it by as much as one progressed in the acquisition of philosophical knowledge. Man's perfection thus lay in the perfection of his philosophical or scientific knowledge and the way to his salvation. Can we just scroll down a bit to see what's the next sentence? What it says? Oh no,
That's all, Prof.
that's all. Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah. So can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So he mentioned here, I think he was referring to Ibn Shatir here. The mosque was certainly not installing a hakim within its walls or an independent philosophical thinker in its walls. When it employed the astronomically informed scholar as a muwakkil. Ibn Shatir was an astronomer, but his function in the mosque was as a timekeeper, muwakkil. His function and expected contribution would be those defined by this latter term. Someone in charge of regulating the times of prayer. It was only natural, of course, if curiosity or interest or whatever would attract the individual muwakkil into areas of research and discovery that lay outside the requirements of his office, as did sometimes happen. But such individual and exceptional effort was likely to receive only limited appreciation from his contemporaries. It was not what they demanded and expected of him. It may be significant, for example, to note, as David King observed, the important research of Ibn Shatir on planetary theory does not seem to have influenced later astronomical work by muwakkils in Syria and Egypt, and so on. So, scientists or astronomers were only entertained in the Islamic world insofar as they serve a religious function, but not entertained as an autonomous group in themselves. Yeah, as an autonomous group of knowledge seekers who are allowed to develop their own field independently and pursue their own research interests independently. Yeah, and this was partly because of the lack of institutionalization of science in the education system, unlike in the West, where it was institutionalized in universities so that scholars were able to develop that knowledge within the confines of university learning, which allows them some autonomy. Whereas a similar kind of arrangement was absent in the Islamic world. And also, can we move to the next few slides, please? I just want to mention something about realism and instrumentalism. This, I think I don't think I have time to discuss this today. I will discuss it in my next class. Next. Okay, realism and instrumentalism in Islamic science. Was Islamic science realist or instrumentalist? And before that, I'll just explain what is meant by realism and instrumentalism. Well, realism basically refers to the position or theory that the aim of science is to find the real truth about the physical reality of nature, about the true nature of the physical world. Yeah. So it's to do with the pursuit of knowledge of the reality of the world. And that the knowledge arrived at through scientific inquiry is supposed to give us this true reality about the physical world. Yeah. Whereas an instrumentalist account of science or instrumentalist position or view of science would deny such an approach and say that, well, science is basically used as a conceptual instrument or to provide us with models of the physical world or the biological world, which enables us to have some sort of control over the physical world without that model necessarily reflecting the true nature of physical reality. Yeah. So I hope you all get this rather subtle philosophical point. This is an important debate in the philosophy of science between realism and instrumentalism. Are scientific realists really true descriptions of the physical world, or are they merely instruments or models of physical phenomena, which does not necessarily give us the true nature of physical reality? Yeah. So in Islamic science, this realist orientation was not encouraged, and it was not really there, because true reality can only be secure, knowledge of true reality can only be secured through religion. And whatever religion says is the ultimate truth. There is no higher truth than that. In other words, you cannot come up with an independent view of reality through a different source of knowledge, such as scientific knowledge. Yeah? And this was the whole issue in the confrontation between Galileo and Roman Catholic Church. Yeah? Because they would, even the Christians, they would not allow two different authorities of knowledge. That is why the Roman Catholic Church clamped down on Galileo, because Galileo's approach was not based on scripture. Galileo's approach was based on independent scientific inquiry. Galileo said that the Bible teaches men how to go to heaven, but not how the heavens go. How the heavens go is the business of the astronomers. So it's a play on the word heaven, you see. Heaven and heavens. Heaven can be understood as paradise, or heavens can be understood as the heavenly bodies, the astronomical world. So in Islam, there's a sort of a similar dichotomy, yeah. And realism as a philosophy of knowledge and as applied to science is not really seriously entertained in the Islamic world, which was in a sense related to the Al-Ghazali phenomena. That for Al-Ghazali, speculative metaphysics as found in Greek philosophy cannot be entertained as a serious alternative view to our knowledge of reality of the physical world. Our knowledge of true reality of the world can only be secured through religion. Yeah? Okay, with that, I end my lecture for tonight. Yeah. I know it's a very difficult topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. I think we will continue the slide in the next lecture, inshallah.
Yes, inshallah.
The fourth lecture. We have two long questions from Prof. Fatah and our beloved brother Nuruddin. Should I read it or can you read it, Prof, on the chat box?
Okay, I'll try and
2 minutes to read this one.
Chat.
From the
this
Prof.
From who? From Brother Nuruddin, is it?
From Prof. Fatah Santoso.
Okay.
On top of
I
it,
see. That's an earlier. Okay. Fatah Santoso. Okay. Just read it first. Yeah. You have mentioned that the decline of Baghdad is an important factor on the decline of Islamic science. According to history, the real power basically just stopped in 945 when the provincial dynasty that was Buwahid took the power of Baghdad. Together with Buwahid, there were many provincial dynasties established. These dynasties, like Baghdad, developed sciences. Were there contributions of such provincial dynasties to progress or decline of Islamic science? Okay. Well, yeah. The sciences did continue after the 10th century. Yeah. Here you mentioned that the real power, although the Abbasid Caliphate did continue to exist after 945. Maybe, as you pointed out, maybe there was no real strong central authority. Yeah. But this does not mean that the Caliphate had dissolved altogether. It was still present. Yeah? And if you look at the contributions made by the Muslim scientists, it continued even after the 10th century. Yeah, 11th century, there was still progress made in the various sciences. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that it ended in 945. Yeah. Maybe it had sort of decentralized itself. Yeah. But even the decentralized authorities would still be supporting the works of the scientists. Yeah. Okay, next question. Professor, I think the West is not only doing the copy-paste process of Islamic civilization, but also deconstructing it. For example, Ibn Rushd's work on two parts of truth. Okay, the two truths, yeah? Religious or revealed truth and rational truth. Yeah? On two parts of truth was previously used to emphasize the harmony between science and religion. But in the West, it is used to say that we no longer need religion. Okay, through science, we can reach the, okay. But in the West, it used to say that we no longer need religion. Through science, we can reach the ultimate truth without religious path. So then they secularize with the shield of Inmerus theology. Please respond. Okay. Okay, this is not completely true. I will explain what I mean by that. And unfortunately, I do not have time to speak on the slide, which has its title, The Great Figures in Western Science and Their Attitude Towards Religion. Yeah? Because if you look at the great scientists in the history of Western science, especially the 17th century and so on, not contemporary, they did not reject religion. In fact, some of them were religious figures. Yeah? And if you look at the teaching of science in the medieval universities, as I've said, they were taught by this class of people called the theologian natural philosophers, like, for example, Jean Burian and Nicole Oret. Yeah? So it was part of the Catholic system, yeah, of belief in education. Yeah? And as for the individual scientists, I mentioned names like, for example, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, René Descartes, and Isaac Newton. And they were all religious figures also, in a sense. Yeah? Or rather, they were still adopting the religious frame of mind. Yeah? For example, Copernicus. Yeah? Maybe not many know that Copernicus was a Catholic priest. He was part of the Catholic clergy. Yeah? Despite him proposing the heliocentric theory, which later on offended the Roman Catholic Church, yeah, he was not against religion. He was part of the religious establishment. So how could he be against religion? And then if you look at Kepler, for example, Kepler was also not against Christianity. Yeah, although he was very much in favor of Platonic philosophy, but that does not mean that he rejected Christianity. And even if you look at Galileo, despite his confrontation with the Roman Catholic Church, he appealed to the philosophy of Saint Augustine, yeah, who was accepted as a religious figure by the Christian community, yeah, although he was a bit of a mystic. Yeah. But Saint Augustine was very much accepted as a Christian sage. Yeah. So for Galileo, he had a different interpretation of religion, which was different from the Roman Catholic Church. For example, one of the arguments he made was that he said that the biblical language is a means of God talking to men at the level at which men can understand. Yeah, because if God were to speak in the Bible in a language like which says that, for example, the sun moves around the earth. The earth moves around the sun, and this is contrary to our ordinary experience. People would not believe in the biblical message. So that was what Galileo said. So he had a way of countering the Roman Catholic Church without necessarily rejecting Christianity. You see, and similarly, if you look at Isaac Newton, yeah, Isaac Newton. Not many people know that apart from his research in physics, he was also into alchemy. He was also interested in alchemy, which was considered as a pseudoscience. And he was also considered by some as a biblical scholar. He studied the Bible. And the interesting thing to me is that Isaac Newton was a Unitarian. He was not a Trinitarian. He rejected the doctrine of the Trinity and accepted the doctrine of the unity of God. So again, Isaac Newton was not an atheist or was not against Christianity. And other figures like, for example, Robert Boyle, they were also devout religious figures. So in the minds of the individual scientists who made important contributions to Western science, they were not at all against religion. Yeah. But of course, later developments, yeah, which has to do more with European society as a whole, and the influence of the philosophers also, not the scientists, influence of the Enlightenment philosophers, some of whom were atheists, like, for example, David Hume. Yeah. But then David Hume was not a scientist, he was more a philosopher. So some of these influences were quite extraneous to science in the West. Yeah. As, for example, Robert Merton say in his Merton thesis, it was a Protestant ethic that supported the development of science in England in the 17th century. So I don't see religion as being necessarily a factor which led, which acted as an impediment in the early rise of science in the West. It was only later. I must admit that there were later developments. For example, 19th century, the theory of evolution by Darwin. Yeah, that also created a confrontation between the church and the scientists. But by that time, religion was already in decline in the West. Yeah, it was not due to science. It was due to other factors in society, where religious authority became less of an influence in society, in European society. Okay, thanks.
With the last one from Brother One Omar, Prof. The last question. Do you think the failure of Catholic as a comprehensive religion is the true cause of the failure of religion to be amalgamated into science, while Islam has better chance than that? It's because Islam never encourages to separate between religion and other sciences.
Yes, okay. As I've said in my argument, if you talk about religion being as an obstructive force in the development of science and as applied to Western society, then yes, I would say that the action taken by the Roman Catholic Church against Galileo was a clear case of religion having a negative impact on the development of science. Because there you can clearly see how the Roman Catholic Church uses its power and authority as institutional force, yeah, where you can call people to trial through the Roman Inquisition and so on. So it's definitely a force which can lead to the stagnation of science, and it did in Europe, yeah, because of its censorship of Galileo and thereby scaring other scientists. Yeah. And but to be fair to the Catholics, yeah, they also have this community of people within the Catholic Church known as the Jesuits. Yeah. And the Jesuits were very much into knowledge and into astronomy. Yeah. So the Jesuits actually tried to reconcile science and religion. And in fact, they have this astronomer called Tycho Brahe who came up with the hybrid theory. Yeah? But even with the presence of the Jesuits, yeah, they couldn't reconcile science and religion all the way. Ultimately, there has to be a rupture, yeah, as can be seen in the case of Galileo, because we have to choose either one. We have to choose the heliocentric theory or the geocentric theory. You cannot have a sort of a hybrid theory. which the Jesuits tried to do to save religion and science. Yeah. So one reason that has been pointed out is because of the presence of a centralized religious authority, as in the form of the Roman Catholic Church, which was quite absent in Islam. Islam, if you talk about central authority, they only had the caliphs, the Khalifa, which was a political and not a spiritual authority or religious authority. So there isn't a sort of a similar priesthood in Islam. There is no priesthood in Islam. We don't have a sort of a imamate, yeah, unlike perhaps in Shia Iran. But in Sunni Islam, we don't have an equivalent of Pope or equivalent of Roman Catholic Church. So Islam, in a sense, does not have that kind of institutional structure which would impede the progress of science. Yeah, the only way it could is perhaps through the sanctions by religious authorities like the ulama. Yeah, but the ulamas don't really have political power. Yeah? They can only censure in terms of religious belief, but they cannot bring them to court or something like that. So in that sense, Islam has more potential, but historically that did not happen. And I've said it's due to a combination of several factors, which includes political factors like the invasion of Baghdad by the Mongols and the disintegration of the Abbasid Caliphate and so on. And also the lack of a realist attitude towards science, which was to do with perhaps the norms and values of the mainstream ulama. Yeah? But the mainstream ulama, their power is not the kind of power which the Roman Catholic Church had. Yeah? So I suppose Islam, you can say potentially it had still some space for epistemological freedom, but somehow or other that did not happen. Okay.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think your last slide, the cultural implication of the scientific revolution, is very important. We will start on that on next lecture, inshallah. We don't have time to discuss tonight.
Yes, I hope we have time.
Okay, Prof, final words for tonight before we close.
Well, I know it's a difficult subject that I've touched on tonight, and perhaps I've not been terribly clear or coherent or sketchy in some parts. But I hope you bear with me and listen to me in the next lecture, and I hope to make myself clearer in the next lecture. So inshallah, things will get better as we move on.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. We'll see you in next lecture, inshallah. Thank you, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.